So, hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Martin Jr., and I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Racial Equity here at CLASP. I would like to welcome you to our inaugural Equity Matters virtual conversation. So, we have created Equity Matters because we want to work with all of you, people from various backgrounds, institutions, and organizations, to address the realities of structural and systemic racism and other inequities faced by low income communities and communities of color. From childcare and early education, labor and worker justice, and immigration to disproportionate issues facing youth, the inequities that exist continue to amount amid consequential policy and court decisions. A question that I always ask is, will we as a country engage in the liberatory work necessary to dismantle dominant practices and create a society that is truly equitable for all people? Or will we sit idly by while current and unborn generations reap the destructive consequences and disproportionate benefits of a do-nothing attitude where the threads of our democracy hang in the balance? This is why we chose our first topic, addressing poverty, racism, and threats to multiracial democracy. We ask that you lean into today's conversation, reflecting upon how we can collectively identify and develop solutions to some of our nation's most insidious challenges that, without intervention, will undermine the life outcome for generations to come. Before I turn the conversation over to our host, Indi Gupta, I would like to direct you to our next poll, focusing on threats to multiracial democracy.
Well, thank you, Eddie. As folks fill out the poll, let me just jump in and note, as Eddie mentioned, we're at a critical moment in our country and the world with international crises as well. And these are concerns that are quite profound and not ones we can ignore. But acting doesn't ensure success. And in my view, acting alone makes success even less likely. So we have to be smart and strategic. We have to continuously learn from each other and from our successes and failures alike. And that's partly what we're hoping to build this learning community for. Now, for those who are less familiar with CLASP, we're a national anti-poverty organization, and poverty affects a disproportionate share of people of color due to the structural, systemic, institutional racism, and more. Decisions by policymakers in the courts, such as Supreme Court decisions to overturn a half century of precedent on multiple fronts. These combine to only undermine opportunities for communities to achieve economic security and economic mobility. And these decisions do more often to reproduce and reinforce racial hierarchies, which are intrinsically unjust, and ultimately harm our ability to build a multiracial and prosperous democracy. During our conversation today, we'll hear from truly dynamic and high-impact leaders whose commitments to ending poverty and racism and pushing back on threats to our democracy are paramount. So for the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to engage in an interactive discussion where speakers will share their own personal and professional experiences and discuss how to address some of our democracy's greatest threats, especially as they relate to achieving economic fairness. And we'll also have a question and answer session halfway through our discussion with polls for you to weigh in on some of the issues we're discussing. And after our speakers address questions, resources will be added to the chat box that relate to the themes of the questions. And these resources and others will also be shared with you following the discussion. As you hear something that resonates with you, please feel free to use the chat box and engage. But now I have a distinct honor and privilege of introducing our speakers for today. And first, I'm going to start with Maya Wiley, who is president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and certainly someone I look to for inspiration and for guidance in our challenging times. And second, we have Richard Steen, who is, among other things, author of Color of Law and Just Action, a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, one of our partners in much of our work. And Richard has been central to all of these fights throughout his career, including in the past and his time at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Third, we'll have Ray Suarez, who's host of On Shifting Ground with World Affairs. Among other hats he has, is visiting professor at NYU Shanghai, and has been really doing some fascinating, powerful research around the sort of recent generation of immigrants, which I hope he'll get to discuss with us. And then fourth, and last but not least, we have Lisa Sharon Harper, who's founder and president of Freedom Road, and author of Fortune and the Very Good Gospel, and who I had the pleasure of working with many years ago during her time at Sojourners as well, and who I think brings a lot of much needed clarity to these conversations. So I'm going to ask each speaker the same question to kick us off. We hope we can stick to 4 minutes or less for each of these responses. And please also include some brief introduction, if you'd like, of yourself and your background and work beyond what I've just provided. So I'm going to ask us to reflect on some words by Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, reflecting on the 60th anniversary of the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. She stated, "If we are going to move forward as a nation, we cannot allow concerns about discomfort to displace knowledge, truth, or history. Our past is filled with too much violence, too much hatred, and too much prejudice. But can we really say we are not confronting those same evils now? The path we need to take, one of remembrance, knowledge, and understanding, is certainly not the easy road, but it is the only one that can guarantee our democracy's ultimate survival." So as we all reflect upon the past and present choices that have perpetuated the economic and racial injustices in our country, including recent court decisions on affirmative action and beyond, Voting Rights Act, which has been continuously shrunk and attacked. I'd love for each of you to tell us what you feel are the greatest threats to multiracial democracy today, how this matters for ensuring economic well-being for everyone, and how we should move forward as a nation to ensure its survival. And feel free to take a moment to reflect, but I'll first turn to Maya, and then we'll move on to Richard, Ray, and Lisa in that order.
Well, thank you, Indy. And let me just say what a pleasure and how humbling it is to be here in the midst of so many powerful and important leaders. I am Maya Wiley. I do lead the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which for those of you who may not know, and we're very proud to have CLASP as a member organization, as well as Sojourners, and almost 240 other organizations that really look like this country, and even much of this world, both in terms of faith, in terms of race, in terms of the types of work that cover and cross all the issues that we're going to talk about today. But because I am fortunate to be at the helm of such an important coalition, I do want to start with just the reflection that I know that it is a traumatizing time for far too many here, because of the unspeakable violence that we are seeing in Israel and in the Gaza. And that pain is a pain that we all share. And I just want to note it and note that there may be many of you who are personally impacted and experiencing that. And just to say, you're not alone. And in that vein, and to the really important question, I just think Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson has really demonstrated both the grace that is nothing short of inspiring in a context of even her own confirmation hearing, which underscored at a very deeply personal level for her, but in a very publicly almost violent nature for some of us on the emotional level of violence, of the attack on her very qualification to serve on the Supreme Court. And with the kinds of questioning that were not only without civility, were not only ideological, they were personal attacks on her as a Black woman and despite her qualification. I think it's really important to name that, especially as she came to be the first Black woman to sit and serve on the Supreme Court. And at a time when we would look back and recognize that it wasn't that long ago where we would see bipartisan support for her nomination and confirmation, and that we would, even in the absence of that support, hear a much more gracious and affirming set of questionings that are hearing, even by those who were not going to support her confirmation. So I say that as its own marker and her own ability and grace to also step into that role and be someone who has demonstrated how important it is to formulate and make strong arguments about democracy, the Constitution, and the values and ideals we need to bring to understanding that law. I just say that because it is so important to remember what her own personal journey had been to get where she has gotten, where she was in a position to make that statement. And I'll make a few quick points because I know we'll cover a lot of this in the conversation. First of all, remember that we are now in a time where that we have never left, and it is a time where the overt physical violence and racism towards people of color in this country, towards people who are LGBTQ, who also are people of all races and identities, of people of different faiths, are actually experiencing violence. And within that context, 62% of those people in this country who have reported hate crimes against them are Black. And that stubborn statistic has been true in the sense of the disproportionality for 30 years, for 30 years of FBI data and gathering, and that we have seen it, whether it is the 10 people, the 10 souls who lost their lives in a Tops supermarket in Buffalo, or the 3 people who lost their lives in a dollar store in Jacksonville, both because of overt anti-Black racism, but also where they could go, walk to, and find the place where they knew Black people would be congregated because of the same systemic structures that said there will be one store for you if you're lucky. It will be an inadequate store, but anyone who wants to target you knows they can go there, and that is where you will be. And that is a kind of vulnerability to violence that is also perpetrated by the fact that in the past 20 years, we have seen that in 80% of our urban areas that have 200,000 people or more are more segregated today, have been resegregating. And so when you think about that violence and when you think about where and how it can happen, and it happens in rural areas too, so I don't mean to suggest that it doesn't. It absolutely does. But those are where we have that kind of research and data point that makes it plain and systemic that the vulnerability exists also because of segregation, which has a deep, long history I know others will speak to, but that we are resegregating, that all of the gains that we have made, and we made mighty gains, they were imperfect, but to try to get to a more perfect union in the form of saying racism and discrimination not only is unlawful, but that we have to take affirmative steps to change what created it. And what we're seeing in the court opinions that you identified, Indy, is not only an attack on affirmative action. It is actually, all of them have been fundamental attacks on both the ability of private, not only public, private institutions to say, we are going to do our best to affirmatively ensure that we have more opportunity for people who we have formally denied it to over hundreds of years in the past. That is true of Harvard. It is true of many institutions. It is true of the public institution of University of North Carolina. But that at the same time, we're even saying, and private companies can now start to discriminate, as we saw with 303 Creative, in terms of a woman who never even was put in a position where she had to deny some or question whether or not she wanted to take a client who was gay or lesbian, and yet was given the power to say she was harmed enough that she should be heard in a court of law, because in the future she might have to serve someone she does not want to serve because she does not like or agree with how they have chosen to live their lives or who they love. And that is something that is going to come for all of us. We could go on and talk about voting rights. We can talk about the attacks on democracy. I won't go through all of it. But I think the fundamental point is about power. And the fundamental problem that we are facing in society is not that we don't have it. We who believe in freedom, we who will not rest. It is that there are a small number of very well-funded people. Leonard Leo himself is $1.6 billion because he was handed a company and he's funding a lot of this work. 3 people can get books banned across this country from our schools and our children. This is about a small number of people with outsized power and who have learned how to go and grab it and take it from the rest of us. And for the purpose of driving division and sending us all backward. And that will only harm people who are white as well. And we should remember that. It does not only come for those who are targeted, it comes for the very institutions that serve to protect and serve all of us. So I will stop there, but you will hear me say power for the rest of this afternoon and for the rest of my breathing days until we overcome, and we shall.
Here, here, here. Well, thank you, Maya. That's a really terrific opening. I'm going to turn it over to Richard. Feel free to pick up on anything Maya said or stick to whatever you're going to say.
Well, thank you, Indy. Thank you, Maya. I also am going to talk about power, but first a bit of an introduction. As you mostly know, I think, I wrote a book almost a decade ago now about demolishing the myth of de facto segregation, demonstrating the reason we're a segregated, really an apartheid society, is because of racially explicit policy on the part of the federal, state, and local governments. I wrote that book. Many people read it and attended the talks I gave like this, and they all asked me, so what can we do about it now? We understand we have an unconstitutional, unlawful system of racial segregation. What can we do about it now? And I told them, I thought about it, and I realized that I needed to give them an answer. So I partnered with my daughter, Leah Rothstein, to write a book called Just Action about what we can do about it now. And here's where I want to talk a bit about power. The underlying assumption of this new book, Just Action, is that there is no context today, no consensus, no national political support for meaningful policy to redress segregation. But once you have a system in which 2 groups of people are unequal, and that system is established by race-conscious public policy of segregation, it's sustained and reinforced in many cases by local policy and programs and practices. And what we're missing today is the power of local people. We spend a lot of time in circles that support racial justice talking about what should be done at a national level. We're not going to get anywhere, at least for the foreseeable future. But what's missing is a reinvigorated civil rights movement at the local level that can take direct action to insist on remedies, small remedies at first. If they're successful, they'll build to greater power and perhaps lead to policies and forces at state and federal levels that will do so. But it's got to start locally, and that's what's missing. If I dare say, too many young people are spending all their time on their phones instead of knocking on doors of their neighbors. And that's a big problem we face. The new movement to redress segregation must be multiracial, biracial actually, and multi-ethnic. African Americans, although they're the biggest victims of segregation, do not have the power and will never have the power on their own to solve it. Without white allies, without allies of other ethnic groups. And so we need a biracial and multi-ethnic effort in local communities. The new book, Just Action, describes dozens and dozens of policies and programs that can be pursued at a local level if people would just get out of their chairs and start working with their neighbors and forming local committees to redress segregation. There is the potential in this country for that kind of a movement. What we say over and over again in Just Action is that 20 million Americans participated in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. 20 million Americans, the biggest outpouring of support for racial justice in this nation's history. Those 20 million Americans weren't only African Americans, although they were demonstrating in support of the importance of African American security and opportunity. They were whites, they were suburban, they were urban, they were middle class as well as lower income. But at the end of those demonstrations, they went home, they put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns and in their windows and did nothing further. We thought, Leah Rothstein, my daughter, and I, that the reason they did nothing further was primarily because they didn't know what to do. And that's up to us to give them things to do. I will give you just a couple of examples, and we can talk much more about this later. In Just Action, we demonstrate and we name the banks in particular that exploited African Americans in the mid-20th century, that by refusing to give them regular mortgages, financing speculators to sell them homes on contract, which were very exploitative terms, selling them homes at 2 and 3 and 4 times their actual value, and then evicting them just as they were about to pay off these loans so that they could exploit another Black family. We identified the banks today whose predecessors conducted this exploitation and exploited the Black community in many cities in this country. Well, those banks are around today. How do we get them to pay recompense? How do we get them to participate in the remedy? We don't do it by simply talking about them or writing books. That's not going to do it. But a local group that embarked on a deliberate step-by-step campaign of research and mobilization and education and eventually pressure might be able to accomplish something along those lines. There are many, many other examples of that we talk about. Perhaps I'll give one more example to demonstrate how local these policies are. You may know that the property tax assessment system in this country is racially discriminatory in effect. It's not racially discriminatory in intent, it's racially discriminatory in effect. African American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate relative to the market value of their homes than white homeowners do. There are many reasons for this. It's widely recognized that this is true. It's been documented by economists that exists in every metropolitan area in this country. The reason is, there are many reasons for it. One reason is that most counties and cities don't reassess properties every year. And over time, as probably most of you realize, properties in white neighborhoods appreciate in value faster than properties in Black neighborhoods do. What that means is it doesn't take more than a year or two for the assessed value of homes in white neighborhoods to be farther below their market value than the assessed value of homes in Black neighborhoods that are closer to their real market value, meaning Black families, Black homeowners are paying property taxes, paying a larger share of the costs of schools and libraries and fire departments than white homeowners are. This is widely recognized. The county assessors have said, yes, we operate a discriminatory system. We don't know how to fix it. Well, this is a purely local issue. The federal government has absolutely nothing to do with property tax assessments. It's a county and city issue and a local mobilization could, if people were educated and mobilized, if those 20 million people, or the share of them in any particular city, were educated about this issue and engage in a campaign to do something about it, you might be able to get recompense for people who have been overtaxed in the past, and a new kind of property tax assessment system going forward that would make a significant dent in the racial inequality that exists in communities all over this country. So there, as I say, in Just Action, we talk about dozens and dozens of these opportunities at a local level. That's where the power initially has to come. Eventually, we need, of course, a national movement. But what's missing today is the base in local communities that can score real victories, that can build upon each other, and lead to much more significant advances. And as I said before, the potential is there. The potential is there. There are people, we're a deeply divided country, of course, but we shouldn't focus only on the opponents. Deeply divided means that we've got close to a majority as well. And that's an enormous asset that we ought to be taking advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And let me say that we'll come back to some of what you've raised. Hopefully, we're a little behind on time, but I'll try to shorten some of the questions going forward. And let me turn it over to Ray to respond to the prompt and what we've heard from Maya and Richard.
Thanks, Indy. I've been a reporter for most of my life. It even sounds bad coming out of my mouth, but yes, the vast majority of my life. And that means spending my life trying to hold up a mirror to society, to show itself to itself, or pop open the hood and reveal to readers, viewers, listeners, just how the machinery inside this thing works. And what I've seen over the long haul of my career is the privilege exercised of a selective retreat into fantasy. So we're in love with the idea of a level playing field. We're in love with the idea of a society of widely distributed opportunity. And we love to pat ourselves on the back over it. Yet, when you show people that when you send out resumes with exactly the same qualifications and exactly the same schools, the only difference on the resumes being that the names on one set of resumes are, let's say, identifiably Black, those people don't get called for job interviews. We know that. We know that when a person is shot, and now in the age of ubiquitous, I mean, think of a world where everybody walks around with a video camera in their pocket. Now in this age, we can't simply, or as simply, retreat into our comfortable space of, well, they must have been doing something wrong. They must have caused this to happen. When you show them, no, in fact, there was no proximate cause for that person to get shot behind the wheel of their car. There was no altercation that led to violence. Violence was resorted to by law enforcement with a gun as one of the first options, rather than de-escalating. You show them. It just doesn't matter because of that selective retreat into fantasy. We know about the patterns and have known for a long time about the patterns that Richard identifies in his scholarship, about the hidden guts of the machine, around the way school districts are drawn and the way money is raised for school districts, the way property taxes are collected, the way we draw lines so that we don't cause white middle class and upper middle class parents to flee public school systems in metropolitan areas around the country because they believe, yes, in theory, it would be great to have an integrated school system, but if you're going to change the boundaries of my kid's elementary school, now I have to start looking for private school alternatives. We know this stuff. And yet, even as we know it, every year, public research organizations ask Americans about prejudice and about opportunity. And what have they said for the last 10 to 15 years? In higher and higher proportions, white Americans are telling public opinion researchers that whites are the most discriminated against members of society. And you just think, well, gosh, I've just spent the last 40 years telling them the different hidden snares and traps and booby traps and hidden trenches and holes that people fall into. And they believe that white people are the most discriminated against members of society. Part of it is that for all that backpatting that we do and all that pride that we have about widely distributed opportunity, the same people who shout from the rooftops that they're capitalists have no problem in limiting the development of human capital in order to hoard opportunity for themselves. It's a deeply problematic part of the way we operate as Americans. A lot of it is just, I want to take care of what's mine. And I want to take care of what's mine, my kids, the value of my house, the way my neighborhood looks and feels to me, that I am willing to actually violate the rules of capitalism and rig the game so that people don't have the same opportunity. What I'm not telling you is that I don't really believe in capitalism, in the development of human and physical capital to its highest and best use by everybody who's in a system, because I really believe that unless I'm winning, it's not really capitalism. So it's a tough moment right now because our racial divisions don't seem to be getting better. And even when you explain what it is that people are asking for, you end up with guys with torches marching around a statue of Robert E. Lee who feel that the future is being taken away from them. And I'm not really sure what to say to that young man who looks down the road and sees a country where people like him aren't going to be in charge all the time and win every argument every time. That's what they're afraid of. And that's the country that's coming. And that's where we're at in 2023. The next 25 years are going to bring that transition. A lot of Americans aren't ready for it. And we don't have a vessel. We don't have a convener. We don't have a way of talking to each other about our misgivings about it, or conversely, why it's really not going to be that scary and not really going to be so bad. We can't handle it. Not right now.
Thank you, Ray. Let me turn things over to Lisa to bring us home on this question. Then I'll sort of chat with folks individually, and we'll try to come back to some of these issues. But I appreciate everyone raising the points they have. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you, Indy. And I also am just absolutely flabbergasted that I'm in this group. I absolutely am a fangirl of everybody on this thing. and I'm honored to be here, part of this conversation. I am sitting on the land that is traditionally for the Lenni Lenape people here in Philadelphia, what we now call the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. And I am struck by Dr. Carol Anderson in her book, Eyes Off the Prize. She tells the story of a moment when A. Philip Randolph took the case of African Americans to Eleanor Roosevelt, asking her to put before the United Nations, which was just forming. In fact, I think Eleanor was in the midst of crafting the UNDHR, that, you know what I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And And so he said, well, this is our chance. This is the chance for people of African descent to get their story heard before the world, and to have the world adjudicate whether or not this is just or not. And this is also happening, mind you, in the context before Brown versus the Board of Education, in the context, in the midst of Plessy versus Ferguson ruling the land, of segregation, of what Richard Rothstein talks about in his book, Color of Law, being pervasive, the segregation being pervasive. And in that context, Eleanor takes the case that A. Philip Randolph has given to her to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and asks him to please take this. I mean, can we please take the case of African Americans to the United Nations, to the international community? And Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, bury it. He says, bury it under a pile. Don't let anybody see this. From that point forward, it was very clear that America was averse to telling the truth about itself. America has been resistant to truth-telling. And it does that for many reasons. I would rather focus on the question of what's the impact of it rather than talk about the reasons for it. We can get to reasons later, but I'd also like to talk about what could happen if we actually did tell the truth. Brian Stevenson says that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. The narrative war is actually the war that we are fighting right now. It is, I believe it's at the heart of the question of power. The reason why we have states that are fighting for AP classes in African-American literature and African-American history to not be taught is specifically for this question of the narrative war. Narrative, we like to say at Freedom Road, shapes worldview. And worldview shapes votes, and votes shape the world. Therefore, narrative shapes the world. So the U.S., until the United States establishes a truth commission, a national truth commission with local outpouring, with local engagement, there will continue to be a narrative war that actually results in legislated evil against all people of color, against LGBTQ community, against women, because the story of who are we and how did we get here will be contested, and confusion invites injustice. So clarity brings the possibility of justice. It's one of the reasons why the civil rights movement was so powerful, is because through the narrative that they showed the world by dramatizing the evil that was happening in the South, they were able to show the world the story of what was happening. And it was able to counter the counter narrative that was being told. Oh, we're good to our Black people. We're fine down here. We're dealing with our Negro problem in our own way. But when you can see Bull Connor unleashing fire hoses on children, and when the whole world mourns with the 3 civil rights workers that were killed, and we now see that they were buried in an earthen dam by police officers and government officials, then the story becomes clear. I think that what we are suffering from now in the years since the civil rights movement is that the story has become so embedded with systemic decisions that were made, things that happened that made us who we are and how we got here, much of which Richard has actually outlined, Ray has outlined, Maya has outlined earlier. So we don't need to go into that again, but just to say that the telling of the story and a national reckoning with the truth is what is needed in order for our nation to even have a hope of moving forward into a period of what I would call in my Christian tradition, confession and repentance. We actually have all that we need. If we were to confess, if we were to agree with God about what is true, about what we have done and what we have left undone, then we as a nation could come together and make decisions based on a common understanding of truth and common commitments then to become the strong nation that we desire to be, by making sure that every people group, all people, including those who have been on top and all those who have been on bottom, are now standing on an equal level playing field in a circle, holding hands, deciding how we will live together and sharing power. I think that we lack, where so far we have lacked the imagination to move toward truth, believing that truth will bring destruction, shame, less than, living in a less than state, a weaker state as a nation. But actually, given that changing demographic, it is our only way to realizing the beloved community that Dr. King talked about.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And I'm really glad we're recording this and we'll have a transcript, because I want to pause and reflect on almost every sentence everyone's sharing with us. We are going to move a little quickly for this next section so we can get to a Q&A, so folks can maybe respond in a minute or less. That would be great. A couple minutes would be all right. I'm going to start with Maya. Maya, one of the values that motivates me in my work, and I sense motivates you as well, is freedom. Often people think of it as a lack of restrictions, and we're facing lots of challenges on those fronts. I mean, there are folks who feel they have to move their family from one state to another so their child can be who their child is and should be. But I also think about how you can't be free if you're unhoused, if you don't have access to the care you need, if you have to apply for hundreds of jobs to get one. We continue to have one of the world's, if not the world's, highest incarceration rates. I'm sort of curious if you could say a little about how you think about how a freedom relates to us building a multiracial democracy to you. I think you're still muted.
I was just reflecting on how hard it was to respond to such an important question in 1 minute. But I will be pointed. We do live in a society that has incarcerated our own imagination. Meaning with the bodies, we have actually incarcerated our imagination for the very thing that Lisa is calling us to, for the very points that Richard has pointed out, with the detriments and impacts that Ray has named. But we're doing it intentionally. And so I think, the short answer is, and I'm just going to tell a quick story on this. When I was in the President's Fighting Hate Summit last year, Unity Summit last year, a man who was white and formerly a white supremacist in an organized white supremacy group, who got out and has spent the last 10 years repenting and atoning for the sins he committed in that group, acknowledging it as his responsibility to try to reverse the damage he had done in society. And when he got asked the question, well, what is it? What is it that would keep other young people like you were from joining in the first place? And he said, healthcare. He said, healthcare. And then he said, and jobs. And then he said, and because I think what we're forgetting is the structure of this incarceration that has also been about incarcerating people of color is also about denying everyone in this country the basic human needs they have and the ability to meet them. And we're seeing this in real time, including in what Ray is saying, and including this competition for resources our system has made scarce and has said that we have to be at odds with one another in order to have. So I think the point is we do need a universal system of healthcare. We do need to think about how we have jobs where people are working harder and still getting evicted from their housing because they can't cover their rent. We need to think about the fact that this isn't sustainable to get us out of the imprisonment of our own imagination and to take care of our needs. And so they're so deeply intertwined, they cannot be separated. And I will also say this. When you have a former white supremacist saying we need universal health care, it's a hell of a statement. And it creates a path to imagining the opportunity and getting out of that incarceration of our own imagination.
That is indeed a hell of a statement. Thank you for sharing that. And Richard, let me turn to you and come back a little bit to what you were talking about related to building a base at the local level. One of our, I think, central theories of change at CLASP is that the political and policymaking process doesn't do enough to engage people who are actually experiencing some of the challenges in an ethical way. How do you think about the path forward for ensuring that people who experience poverty and racial injustice can participate in our democracy, really at all levels?
Well, you know, a lot of what I've heard so far in this webinar, and I agree with virtually everything that Ray and Maya and Lisa have said, but it's all about how terrible things are. We'll never make progress by focusing only on how terrible things are. The only way we'll make progress is by looking for our opportunities. And the way to engage people who are most oppressed by this system is to unite them with people who support them who are not so oppressed, and creating a true multiracial, multi-ethnic movement. It can't be built by feeling sorry for ourselves. It can't be built by focusing only on the terrible problems we face. It can only be built by seeing the potential that people have. I will say this, you know, I have spent the last, 10 years traveling around the country, talking about these kinds of problems. Many of my audiences were African American. Many of them were white. The notion that there's not a white base there, that all whites are supremacist, is not true. Of course, I like to say I've spoken in every blue dot in every red state in the country, but there are blue dots in every red state in the country. And there are vast numbers of people who don't know what to do and would like to do something to move us forward. So I don't disagree with the analyses of how terrible things are. I do think that we also ought to look at the enormous progress that we've made in the last half century when it comes to racial justice and racial opportunity. We have a large African American professional middle class today that didn't exist half a century ago, that can participate in the leadership of this kind of movement. We ought to focus on that. The earlier civil rights movements in this country, particularly in the mid-20th century, were not racially exclusive. They could not have made the progress that they made without collaboration between African American and white groups. And I think we need to focus on that possibility again. I'm confident that it exists, but it's quiescent, and we need to make it unquiescent. In our book, let me say, A Color of the Just Action, rather, the new book, we begin it by talking about groups of people who have formed cross-racial relationships, and how easy it is if you just attempt to do it, and what potential there is for turning those relationships into action not just feel good, but into action that is going to redress segregation. So I like to look at the opportunities we have. I don't deny the terrible assaults that we experience, but I want to look at the opportunities we have and focus more on those and less on our crises.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. Ray, I want to give you a minute or two to respond. I think a lot about how in your career you have quite literally sort of lifted up the voices of some folks who are the most marginalized in our society, whether it's when you're a reporter in Chicago or in very national and international roles. So I want to sort of come back to how we do that in ways that are constructive. How do we lift up and give voice or get out of the way sometimes maybe so that we can hear the voices of folks who are most marginalized?
Well, we have to get out of the rote ways we have of doing certain stories. And, you know, I'm no brilliant, insightful guy who was doing journalism in a way that it was never done before. I did little things like the standard way we would cover an electricity rate increase for television in Chicago was to run a camera crew out to downtown and ask white people about electricity prices going up as if everybody didn't pay a light bill. And I wouldn't do that. And I was very clear about why, and very clear about why I talked to the people that I talked to with my bosses and with my producers. And, you know, why shouldn't a ubiquitous experience be understood for its ubiquity and the way, as Bob Marley reminded us, when the rain falls, it don't fall on one man's house. These little things, the shared challenges and the shared humanity of everyone who's facing life in a big metropolitan area should be what you see on the screen when you turn on the evening news. But much of American journalism is a story told by rich people to middle-class people about poor people, pathologizing them and setting them aside as the problem people in our society. American journalism speaks with an upper middle-class voice, and we don't really think a lot about how that affects the way we see the country. But you see it again and again. I mean, in its most egregious forms, when you look at the coverage, for instance, of the civil unrest that followed the Rodney King verdict. There were rich anchor people sitting at an anchor desk miles away from where the action was happening, basically fretting and wringing their hands about this as if it was inexplicable that this world, this out of control world in South Central Los Angeles and many other places, was just a place that they couldn't understand. And they were watching it from helicopters, the way we look at drone footage today. But that's been repeated again and again and again because we tell ourselves one kind of story about the country. The way that we've lucked out, and let me agree heartily with Richard on this score. Yes, there's been tremendous progress, but it's often been in spite of the system rather than aided by the system. And we have to deal with that and what the consequences of that really are. One great gift to this country is that the modern generations of immigrants coming here buy into the whole American dream. No matter how hard they've had it themselves, there is this tremendous gas tank that they have that's filled with that American dream fuel. And they are ready to stand in water that's up to here and hold up their own children and hold up their own descendants and really believe that things are going to get better, even when we demonize, marginalize, criminalize, and describe them in ways that we would describe a pestilence, the way we would describe a plague of locusts, or the sudden arrival of rampaging animals that would destroy our farms and crops and cities. We're watching this happen right now on the border. The sending countries, the birth countries of American immigrants, have in just over a century moved from virtually entirely white, because by law and by custom, you could only really immigrate to the United States if you were a white person and naturalize, to virtually all non-white. 9 out of the 10 sending countries of foreign-born Americans now send non-white immigrants to this country, which has given us the opportunity to repeat the errors of the 19th century in the way that we thought about immigration and talked about immigrants and legally constrained them and fretted about whether these people would ever become American and whether they'd ever get the hang of being members of us. The people who come here now are so willing to put up with almost everything in order to join this big us, that we should kiss them all on both cheeks every day instead of demonizing them, because it's shocking just how much they've bought in, how much the buy-in is already there from the day they arrive. We don't realize just how lucky we are.
I appreciate that, Ray, and that could be a theme in many ways. There's a lot of us who don't realize how lucky we are, and some of those folks are filling out those surveys and saying that they're the ones who are discriminated against when they, as a collective group, often have the most power. We are going to try to jump to questions in a second. Lisa, I would love to get your thoughts on the role of organizing and mobilizing as it relates to power building, especially as we've at CLASP do a lot of terrific work around labor and worker justice. And we have certainly been highly engaged as auto workers. Many thousands of them have organized throughout the country and in lots of other sectors as well. It does seem to be a moment here, especially in poor communities of color, where Dr. King described immoral power is met with powerless morality. So can you talk to us a little about the role of organizing and mobilizing to power building as we think about our multiracial democracy?
Yes, I can. And my dog just started barking. Babe, leave it. Leave it.
If your dog has something to say,
she does. She always does. Her name is Babe. Sorry for this, guys. Babe, stop. Come on. So central to the impact of organizing is that what it does is it actually brings people together. Central to the goal of what I believe in my Christian tradition, again, and not just, I think it's actually Judeo-Christian tradition, the goal of God, the goal of the kingdom of God is reconnection, that we would all become reconnected, not only to each other, but also to the earth, to God, to ourselves, to our communities, within our families, between nations. That connection, radical connection, is what characterizes the beloved community that Dr. King referred to. It's all about radical connection. And one of the things that that organizing does at its core is to reconnect people with with the reality of their power, of their God-given call to exercise agency in the world, that they are not powerless, that the actions they take can make a difference, that they have voice given by God, that when spoken can change things. Again, that was, I think, at the core of the power of the civil rights movement. It's the core of the power of the movement that we saw in the organizing that happened in India under Gandhi. We understand that what organizing does is it reconnects us, not only to ourselves, but also to each other and to the systems that govern us. It gives people the ability to speak directly to the systems that govern them and tell them, this is not working, or this would work better. And in the doing, it actually fans the flame of human dignity in all of us and gives us an opportunity to come back together. So I'm going to keep this short, but I think that is the power of organizing, that organizing fans the flame of humanity, and the doing gives us the possibility of a more flourishing society.
Wonderful. I appreciate that, Lisa. We are getting a few questions in the chat. In the Q&A. Let's focus on the Q&A box. And Maya, if there's any that speak to you, I was going to give you a chance to respond. Can you see the questions in the Q&A?
Yes. And I see Lori's question about people being disillusioned because they can't really see past having to struggle to survive day to day. How do I begin a conversation that might give a sense of power to community to start engaging? And I think this is such a critical question. I do think it also goes back to Richard's important point. And I see lots of possibility. I'm very hopeful about possibility. Possibility is not inevitability, but the power that we have, and the power that I was talking about at the beginning, goes exactly to this point. The truth is, what we want to accomplish, we will, when people who are struggling understand and believe in their power if they show up and demand. And when we have had movement that has attained some of this promise that we have gained in our democracy, it is because that has happened. And I say that as a daughter of a father who organized Black and other women who were on welfare to demand dignity at the welfare office and a guaranteed minimum income. But what it requires, first of all, is finding the place where people can see the thing that they need and understand whether there's a path to get it if they participate. And I'll give you an example. And I used it, if we think about 18 to 35-year-olds, and this goes to Ray's point about changing demographics. And I gave this talk, race relations talk at Northern Virginia Community College. First generation students, many of them, if not all of them, college students, many of them struggling to work to be in community college, not really able to afford it easily. Many of them first generation American, extremely diverse. And to a person, there was a lot of clarity that they didn't feel much power, even as they were struggling to do better and be the generation that does better. And I understood, and I tried to tell them, I said, what do you think happens when your generation that looks like the future of the country actually shows up to vote? And I talked about demographics is not destiny, but I actually described when and how we've had victory in the past in the civil rights movement, how hard it was, how long it took, but because people showed up and people who didn't have a lot. And what I said is, you are going to be a third of the electorate very soon. And if you show up at the polls, if you show up, people have to come to your community and ask what you want and need, and you shape the agenda because you will actually drive the difference between people who want power getting it or not getting it. And it is that simple. And I could speak to that as a person who ran for public office. And I said, I'm going to tell you, candidates get told, don't go to that neighborhood, they don't vote. It's a waste of your time. And so that is a shift. And I had students, including a young man who was Black, who did not vote in 2020, even though he was registered, because he felt it wouldn't make a difference. And when I told him, and I said that, his professor came back to me and said, he's going to vote in the midterms in 22, and understands he won't get all he wants just because he showed up to vote, that's a starting point, not an ending point. But it is instilling that, but also based on what people want, right? We have to listen to folks about what their priorities are. And I will say one thing also, in total agreement with Richard, with your point, but you can't tell Black people we won so much right now. I just want to be really plain about that. What you can tell Black people is, yeah, it's really bad and hard out here. It's really bad and hard out here. And this is what we've been able to do. And this is how we are able to garner and do more of it. So I say that to you not as a perfect answer, because there aren't perfect answers, but helping people find where and how they can enter the work in a way that they can meet, but that speaks to their need. And when those welfare mothers got together, it was because their babies were hungry and they saw a way to come together and demand that they had enough resources so that their babies wouldn't be hungry. And they did some winning, including I won't go. Storming Caesar's Palace, go watch it if you want to see how you can help very, very, very low income people find their power.
Thank you, Maya. I'm going to turn it to Lisa to take on at least one question. Lisa, feel free to jump in on another. And Richard, at some point, I'd love to get your reaction to some of Maya's points. Go ahead, Lisa.
Sure. Thank you. I'd love to respond to Lynn Hopkins, who asks, as from a perspective of speaking from white activist clergy position, do you see religious institutions having a significant role in this work, or has that day passed in this culture of nuns, as in N-O-N-E-S, nuns? And so I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for asking that question. It's a really great question. It's one that I think a lot of people are wondering right now. But I want to just say that in all of the major, well, not all, but most of the major movements that we have seen that have moved and changed the United States of America and many around the world through nonviolent means, they have all been movements of faith. They've all been centered in communities of faith. We absolutely see that in the abolitionist movement. We see that in the civil rights movement. We see that in the suffragist movement. We even see that in the latter stages of the LGBTQ movement. We see that in all of the major movements, in the environmental justice movement as well, started in the church. Why is that? Why would that be the case? It's the case because it takes faith to go up against Goliath. I mean, it takes faith for people who are deemed and told that they have no power to believe that they have the ability to slay a giant. And make no mistake, the powers that are aligned against people of color, poor people, LGBTQ people, women are a legislated, judiciated. They are a giant. They come against in large form and pervasive. Now, there have been many successes. And so the question of whether or not this is still the case, whether or not faith still has a role, is a valid question, given the reality that most people are running from organized religion because of, I believe, the failure of organized religion, especially over the last 20, 30, maybe 40 years, to live up to the call and the standard of our espoused faiths. In fact, what I would go so far as to say is that, generally speaking, our faiths have been colonized. They've been colonized by empire, by power, and in order to work for the benefit of power. And we have, even in the Black church, we have fallen victim to, health, wealth doctrines and prosperity doctrines and things like that, prosperity gospels, rather than understanding that Jesus himself, in the Christian tradition, Jesus himself was a brown, colonized, indigenous human being from a serially enslaved people group who did not have legislated, judicial, or any kind of structural power, but because of his organizing, was able to change the world. I've seen in recent days the work of organizing among, for me, I'm organizing evangelicals right now, evangelical institutions, working with the Carter Center to organize evangelical institutions to move into a 3-year truth-telling initiative where they are investigating their own decisions that they have made. What are the stories that they tell about themselves? How are those stories covering over or squashing certain other people's truths in order to save face or save their own power? How can they engage in a process of confession and repentance? And I'm telling you, it is only through faith that they can enter into that, because it does not stand to reason that you would want to out yourself. But that's what's needed in order for us to find health and truth. So only faith can actually get us there. And conversely, with people who are on the other side of injustice and oppression, it is faith that gives us the belief and the courage to walk in the truth that we too are made in the image of God. We too are created to exercise agency in the world, to speak and have our words create ripples, and to walk and to have our steps change the earth.
Thank you, Lisa. And yes, we all certainly have to believe something against the odds too, to some extent. But that's how the world has changed. Ray, do you want to weigh in on any of the questions in the box or anything that's been muted for me? It's a little choppy. Ray, just one sec. Why don't we go to Richard quickly? Let me see if it's something on our end or yours. But Richard, go ahead and jump in. Ray, I'll come back to you.
Well, okay, I don't see any questions in the Q&A for me, but I'll comment on some of the previous statements that were made. First of all, every one of you, us, me, in this webinar are not just professionals. I'm not just talking about the class staff, but every one of you who are participating. You're also citizens and residents of your local communities. And I think you should think about that role first, not what you can do in your professional roles, but what you can do, what we all can do in our own communities to begin the process of mobilizing people to make progress in a new, reinvigorated, I'll use the old term, civil rights movement that can begin to make progress. Let me make another point. I think there's a terrible trope in this country, and it's something I hear frequently, and we've heard it some here today. Poor people and African Americans are not the same thing. Most African Americans are not poor. They have jobs. They have families. 40% of all African Americans are homeowners. That's much, much less than the white percentage of 70%. But 40% are homeowners. We cannot build a movement that's only of the poor and expect to succeed. We need not only a biracial and multi-ethnic movement, we need a multi-class movement. If we're going to assemble the kind of political power, first in local communities and then perhaps statewide and then perhaps nationally, to make the kind of progress that we need. The only way to do that is by getting out in the streets and organizing. Maya talked about the fact that young people don't vote very much. Well, we need to start knocking on their doors now and making sure not only that they're registered, but that we're reminding them constantly of the importance of voting between now and a year from now, when it matters. I think Maya it was who talked earlier, or maybe it was somebody else, or maybe it was Ray, who talked about how people with blacks and whites with similar credentials and qualifications are hired at different rates. Well, the same thing is true of housing opportunities. There are paired testing programs that exist throughout the country, mostly conducted by fair housing centers, which are terribly underfunded and have very few resources to conduct paired testing of landlords, of realtors, to identify discrimination. There was a study, a report done a couple of years ago by Long Island Newsday that they hired actors to both black and white actors to present themselves to realtors. This was a housing sales test, not a landlord rental test, but it's actually easy to do with rentals. And they demonstrated that 50% of all interactions that African Americans have with realtors today 50 years, over 50 years after the Fair Housing Act was passed, over 50% of African Americans experience discrimination. Now, fair housing centers don't have well, they're not located in New York, most of them, so they can't find unemployed actors to hire. They require volunteers. Every one of us can volunteer for these organizations as pair testers of landlords and of realtors to begin to wipe out ongoing discrimination that exists, as I say, over 50 years after the Fair Housing Act. So our book, Just Action, and my previous book, The Color of Law, is directed at citizens and residents, not at professionals, because it's in your local communities and our local communities where this process has to start if we're going to make progress. And it has to be both biracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-class as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Ray, I really want to see if we can get you in here.
Well, I checked all my connections and okay. I don't know why you couldn't hear me before. Maite asks, these conversations can have elitist and or academic tones. I say elitist due to the fact that education is out of reach in this country. How can we meet people where they are and connect everyday life to these institutional disparities? One of the most potent communicators of social realities to people of all educational backgrounds is unions. They do a lot of organizing and education at the grassroots level that helps their members understand, and members they hope to organize, future possible members, help them understand the score. People's movements have done a really good job at this. I remember Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan, or the streets of Chicago across from the Chicago Board of Trade during Occupy Wall Street. And there was a lot of, I didn't always agree with some of the conclusions that were being made by some of the people who were teaching and speaking and preaching about economic realities in the United States. But it was really powerful to be in those crowds with people of all different educational backgrounds, basically consciousness raising to each other. Groups like Voto Latino, which tries to take young Latinos and make them into regular voters, not one and done voters, to get them in the habit of voting. They do a lot of really powerful teaching that wipes out that need for credentials and sheepskins in order to be perceived as smart and understanding your own predicament. Ai-jen Poo, who's organized domestic workers across the country and home healthcare workers, is a tremendous transmitter of knowledge at a level where even some of the least educated workers in our society can get it. The Fight for 15. Look at the tremendous work that they've done, organizing people like fast food workers who are in the hundreds of thousands, mostly high school diploma and GED. They are not people who have MSs in economics, but they understand their own predicaments, and they learn more in coming off the shift and joining workers to discuss how to move forward, how to organize. One of the terms that's thrown around like confetti in our society that drives me around the bend, that really gives me a pain, is identity politics. Because if you want people to vote for you, if you are talking to groups in society that you think are inclined to vote for you, and you design policy that speaks to them and their needs, that's not identity. That's just politics. And some of the people who complain about identity politics have absolutely no problem with indulging in God talk and waving Jesus around in order to get people to vote for them. And they would be very, very upset if you accuse them of identity politics. Let's ban that from our discourse. It's a dumb term and it means hardly anything.
Thank you, Ray. So glad that that mic was flawless just now. I know we're down to our last many minutes together for this conversation. I'm going to turn to Lisa quickly, but just so everyone will have some chance to maybe give a quick final reflection on a response to a question I'll ask. If folks can be as efficient as they can. Lisa, I'm going to ask you about reparations. It has come up in a big way at all levels of government, in private institutions. Maya pointed out that the courts have basically tied their hands or trying to tie their hands. While there's full agency in any backlash, there's always a backlash. You can see our progress on voting rights, where we basically closed black-white gaps, and it only took a century, and the backlash has been there and is persistent and is not letting up. But yet, everyone here has spoken about the need to distinguish between the aspiration of this country and the reality of this country, especially grapple with our past. So, how do you think about how folks should move forward in thinking about advocating for working on reparations in that context?
Well, Indy, you are aware that my book Fortune traces 10 generations of my family's story on American soil. It goes back to 1682 and goes forward to me and my family's generation. And what I found in doing that research was that there is a consistent line of decisions that have been made that are government-based decisions that changed the course and determined the course of my family's future, of the possibilities for us as a family. Everything from the very first race law in Virginia that then catalyzed the second ever race law in Maryland, which is the law that captured my own family in that whole loop. And then going to the decisions to make slavery even more heinous and clamp down on it in South Carolina, which entrapped my third great grandmother, Leah Ballard, and made her have to sit in slavery for 30 more years than she might have, because at the time they were thinking that they might need to kind of incrementally beg off of this thing after Denmark Vesey, his attempted insurrection. To the decisions, the court decisions around Plessy versus Ferguson and others. So decisions that have been made have actually caused loss in African-American families. This is not just an ethereal conversation. This is a conversation that has impacted the course of families in America in location. So a solution has to be government-based, because it's government decisions that have caused the harm. And it also has to have local implications as well. So you have to be able to deal with the issues as they are surfacing in local spaces. Core to my understanding of reparations is that it is really truly about repairing what the hierarchies of human belonging that our decisions created, the brokenness that it created in a people group and in society. So to some respect, the repair is happening on an ongoing basis through legislation and executive orders and the rest. But that is not necessarily reparation. Reparation is also about repairing the relationship that was broken. And fundamental to the broken relationship was the failure to recognize the right of agency of a people group over their own lives and futures. So I believe that it is incumbent on the governments of the United States of America to shift the focus and its ears to the African-American community itself, to ask African Americans, what is it that you say we should do? And then do it. We see an example of this in Scripture We see David ask that of the Gibeonites who come to him when his land is in the middle of a big old drought. And he says to God, why is this drought happening? And then the Gibeonites come knocking on the door and say, Mr. David, we have a bone to pick with you. Saul, the previous ruler, not you, but Saul, the previous ruler, tried to kill all of us, and he wasn't supposed to do that. And then David says, that's why we have a drought in the land. And he says to them something I dream of us saying in America. What do you say we should do in order to make things well with you? That is what we need to do in America with people of African descent. And there are already many different visions of what needs to happen that have been put forward. Everything from HR 40 to the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Commission, to the movement for Black Lives vision for what it would take. Listen to the community that is impacted. And in doing that, we will all find our health and our healing.
Thank you, Lisa. We have just a couple minutes left, so it's going to be a true lightning round, 30 seconds or less each. Final thoughts. I'll go with Maya, Ray, Richard, and back to you, Lisa, to close this before I turn it over to Eddie.
So my final thought is there's so many things we can do. It's impossible in a minute to name them all. I will name one. Every single person on this Zoom can do something to engage people in understanding that it makes a difference if they vote. In all these contexts, talking to people about what they care about and what they should be shaping the conversation around. I think Lisa shared a lot of possibility, as did everyone. Richard's point about the local is so important. At the end of the day, every single one of us, because we are actually in a time when it is not that we don't have the numbers to move policy. It's that we don't have the belief in the possibility of the difference we make when we participate. And it is critical. I put in the chat and stillivote.org. That is the Leadership Conferences campaign to do everything to support both local groups that are doing voter education, GOTV, to share best practices and be able to connect people to opportunities. There are many, many, many others. It's a coalitional strategy. But at the end of the day, it does go back to what change are we trying to make, and making people see how they can participate in making that change. And I have a deep belief in the possibility of that.
Well said. Thank you, Maya. Ray?
One thing we really have to work on is being a little less mean. America's gotten pretty mean. And sometimes seeing our way out of some of these problems is not anything more complicated than just asking yourself, what would I want for myself and my family in getting out of this predicament? Instead of being obsessed with whether people deserve things, or whether they worked as hard as I did, or whether they're getting something that is not by right theirs. Ask yourself what it would take to just get over in America, and wonder if what you're doing is making that harder for people. There's a lot of hoarding of opportunity. There's a lot of hoarding of resources. There really a kind of meanness in our politics that's epitomized by the term social justice warrior being a term of derision and put down instead of one of praise and admiration. So I know it might sound a little simplistic after all this very high level conversation that we've been having over the last period, but boy, this has gotten to be a mean country with mean politics, and a little less mean would go a long way.
Much, much appreciated, Ray. Richard, quickly, and then Lisa before I turn it over to Eddie.
Well, as you noted in your chat request, we do this. I've already given lots of examples. All I can say is that in Just Action, we have dozens more. We don't recommend any particular place that people should start in their local community. Start anywhere. I do agree with Maya that getting people who are not inclined to vote, but who are supportive of equality and justice has to be a very high priority. But the important thing is that people get active on any issue, because it will spread. Every community is different. Every community has different opportunities. And like I say, we have so many examples in our book, Just Action, of things you can start with. It doesn't matter where.
Thank you, Richard. Lisa.
Sorry, I just posted. I co-wrote a song and co-produced a song called Fly, aka Fortune's song. It's actually inspired by Fortune Game McGee, who was my 10 times great grandmother, born in 1687 in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And it tells the story, and it actually calls for truth and reparation. And I would say the number one thing everybody can do is to become reconnected, reconnect to yourself, reconnect to God, reconnect to those who have been othered, and reconnect to the earth. That is what is needed right now.
And it's a wonderful song that we will circulate. Thank you, Lisa, for flagging that. Well, just thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Eddie, to wrap us up, but I am so grateful to each of you, Richard, Ray, Lisa, and Maya.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in today's virtual discussion. We had a fabulous conversation with some amazing speakers. We have posted our post-discussion survey in today's chat, and we would like you to complete it. We will also be sharing the chat box links that we were posting in the chat with you via email, which includes a link to a fly that Lisa just mentioned. As we depart this space, we ask you to consider how you would integrate the feedback from our speakers into your personal and professional lives as you work to ensure economic justice, eliminate institutional and structural racism, repair harm, and promote societal healing, many things that our speakers were talking about. We ask that you continue to center racial equity and economic justice in your work to maximize impact and eliminate all threats to multiracial democracy. We ask when you do this to think concretely when you move this work forward. We ask you to stay connected with us here at class as we continue to share resources regarding Equity Matters. We'll have our next conversation in a few more months, and we'll make sure that you are informed of the way that we'll be moving this conversation forward. We also posted in the link, including one of our conversations called Indian Friends, where we'll be building power and advocacy, and we'll be centering the lives of people with a lived experience. So continue to stay in touch. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for joining this conversation, and we hope that you have a wonderful week. Bye, everyone.